let's just throw out there that in terms of identity and communities for which many of us belong, the census has never really super got that right. So talking about the definitions, the census definitions themselves, in 2010 they came out with these new definitions that defined that defined American Indian Alaska Native people as anyone with indigenous roots in North, Central, or South America. So that's 2010, the latest census before this one. And um, while I think philosophically that is probably super close to how many of us feel, um, it is not reflective um, of the commitment that the U.S. made to tribes who are within its borders. So it's not reflective of tribal. So it essentially changes the definition that has been upheld for decades and centuries by Congress and the Supreme Court. It's a totally different definition. So one, it was an act of complete miseducation for all all people who were living in the United States at the time. So you have everyone thinking that the definition of American Indian Alaska Native is anyone who, and so the census and its, and the fact that now as well, right, we have many Two-Spirit people, so people who are gender fluid, who are many genders, and who are not at all reflected also in the census ORIS process. And so just to say that at its core, this idea of categorizing people and the data aggregation sometimes of the census. So right, if someone clicks more than one, you know, sometimes it can be used to say, okay, well then they don't get to be fully, you know, fully white and American Indian Alaska Native. They get kicked off into this other box called multiracial, and then the data is aggregated. So people don't get to be wholly who they are, even though in some of what the census has, you know, has said previously, historically has said, we want you to check everything, or we want you to check the only thing, or the thing that's majority or whatever. So, but particular to hard to count communities, and particularly Native communities, the hardest to count community in Oregon for the last census, 2010, was the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. So they're in Central Oregon, and they're also the largest tribe in Oregon. So just by number, sheer number of folks. And this year round, it isn't any different. They are still the hardest to count community, and we've been we at We Count in our campaign have been working very closely with the census team over at Warm Springs, and especially now that COVID has hit, to make sure that they have all they need, and that, you know, that we're being responsive in terms of a plan to help them get toward that complete count, right? Because we know that with the CARES Act just coming out, and the dollars that are allocated based on census data, that it's important, especially to ensure that we're taking our lead from tribes, and making sure that we respect whether they're closed or open, what's happening in terms of public health. Right now, as we speak, there's a hotspot, and cases are multiplying in Warm Springs at a higher rate. We both saw, and I'm sure many of the students saw, the new Oregonian data about hotspots in the state of Oregon, and one is down in Warm Springs. So we're really, at We Count, we're doubling down on, you know, communicating and trying to support as much as we can, just the development of a plan over time. And that doesn't come with like static dates, like you will start doing this by this date, or we're actually, you know what, our first our first concern is for the health and well-being of this community, and that's really where we based our campaign ethos, is in that idea. So it wasn't necessarily about, you know, the census and its relationship to the Constitution or some arbitrary deadlines where we have to, you know, get this stuff to the president. Um, those can and should all be moved in situations like this. And we at We Count can absolutely advocate for tribes doing this. Yes, there's this also something that makes tribes unique is that there's a government to government process. So the Census Bureau is talking to tribes on a government to government basis to work out what their plan should be. But We Count and tribes are also talking to each other, right? When those things start to go right, not well, and they often do. Uh, Multiple tribes who are working, right? When you're working on a one-on-one basis where someone holds the power and the money and the other person doesn't, right? How can you ever get to an authentic, you know, real conversation that's going to be community based in that kind of situation? You can't. And so to have tribes come together through, whether it's through We Count or the other tribal entities that exist, advocacy entities that exist, like affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, like the Portland Area Indian Health Board that has, you know, a semi-governmental role. Um, those venues are particularly important because that's how we bring our collective power, our collective thoughts together. Because when we're in a one-on-one negotiating position, right, with many of these bureaus who are in large part, and this is not always the case, peopled with folks who didn't grow up learning about tribes in their civics classes, right? They didn't grow up learning about, you know, the different forms of government in relationship to tribes and tribal sovereignty, and whether or not, you know, what was their local tribe as they were growing up in elementary school. Many of these folks who are adults serving in these bureaus did not grow up with um, that kind of education, that kind of content included in their education. So it's something that they're not super skilled at navigating. Um, so I think for me, it's a combination of all sorts of things that kind of lead to the context of like what happens in this short period of time at the census. Um, it's everything. It's settler colonial culture. It's the lack of education, and it's an imbalance of power and authority in how government to government relationships happen. It's all of those things that kind of go into what the census is. But what it should be and what we can aspire for it to be is something that is we've those are all the ways that I think that um, okay, let me stop. The census has historically been, I feel like, politicized in ways, right? Not counting, because of the mistrust in many marginalized communities. The process has been uh, reflective of that mistrust over time. And I think that's why hard to count communities are hard to count, right? Because we don't trust, we don't trust that this process is going to reflect us and who we are, all of who we are, all of our families. Um, and we've witnessed ways where government processes have been infiltrated, right, by folks who wish us ill, and utilized for those purposes. Um, and I think at this point, those of us who are involved in the We Can't campaign and the work that's happening absolutely believe in transforming that system and doing all we can to ensure that our communities are are represented and represented well.